I got into this business. I've been doing online business for since 2010. I've got a background in sound, video, technology, online platforms since 2005. And what really put me into the whole area of we've got to get you on a podcast. I got into podcasts because during the pandemic, I realized if I'm stuck in my house, if I wanted to actually survive the pandemic, I needed to be doing what I love most, and that is highlighting and showcasing women that are, as I like to call it, the tagline for my podcast is conversations with women doing awesome shit. So I kind of got started with that during the pandemic, creating their videos, creating their audio, creating their podcasts. And what I really quickly realized was, as much as these women were amazing and they were doing awesome shit, as I refer to it, they didn't generally know how to describe it, how to articulate that in a way that got it across so that the listeners realize, oh my God, she's all that, as the name of my podcast is. So I ended up starting a side part of my business, which was to help entrepreneurs figure out how to leverage this amazing opportunity that's happening right now, which is podcasts and podcast guesting.
So September, what are some of the benefits of getting on a podcast or a show?
As you had mentioned at the very outset, this is all about going big with your business. And to do that, we have to get out of our comfort zone, as Jon had said. And most of that is speaking. Get out there and speaking. And there are, of course, there's speaking from the stage, like TEDx that we're going to be talking about later, podcast guesting, TV interviews, streaming events. There are a lot of modalities you can be getting involved with. But the benefits of the podcast, and each one of these media mix have their own value and their own benefits and things you can be leveraging. With podcast, one of them is it's not social media, it's broadcast. And think of podcasts like Netflix for audio. This is a curated body of a library of content that people come to. 1 billion people weekly, globally, come to listen to podcasts. And on average, those people listen for 7 hours a week. The great thing about this, again, not social media, is not throttled by algorithms, nor by a million people coming in and putting their interruptive posts on there. That is going to make your content disappear. The lifespan, the longevity of podcast content is the longest you can find out there. It blows the doors off social media, but it also is longer than blogs. And while TV and speaking are great, they're not being actively pushed and promoted on an ongoing basis on a broadcast platform like podcasts are. So to get your content on there is huge. This will be like a brand ambassador for you, speaking for you, and people will be finding it for years to come.
So are podcasts oversaturated?
No, I did actually see that on your business page, and I think you have to compare it to, say, for example, blogs. Blogs, there are literally half a billion, 500 million blogs out there. There are 2.4 million podcasts. That means that there is 0.4% of the number of podcasts as there are to blogs. These are both forms of video vehicles that you can be getting your message out. It's not saturated. However, it doesn't help that this year Forbes, well, it's a good thing and a bad thing. Forbes magazine announced this year that podcasts were one of the best marketing channels for 2021 and going forward. So, of course, the first thing that all the business gurus did on channels like LinkedIn was start screaming, start a podcast, start a podcast, start a podcast. And there was an even faster acceleration of the number of new podcasts coming online. And it's not so much that it's saturated. It takes a lot to get momentum and to get your podcast growing and to build your audience.
Right. And your audience your podcast isn't going to be for everybody. You're going to find, it takes a while to find those people that are going to want to listen to your podcast. Yeah. Absolutely.
Which is why, so podcasts themselves are an amazing vehicle. They're an amazing platform that you can be leveraging. I'm a podcaster. I'm coming in with my second podcast, which is all around how to leverage podcast guesting. Hashtag work smarter, not harder. If you're focusing on being a podcast guest, and that's right for your business and the way you're going to be building your brand, you're leveraging other people's existing audiences and their networks. And it's quite literally 5 to 10% of the work of actually producing an episode is to be the star of an episode. Who wouldn't want to get their brand story out there with a fraction of the effort that it takes to get that episode out there? Somebody's co-creating it for you, and they're promoting it for you. It's an amazing opportunity.
It really is. And we have some questions from the audience. So what is the best way to introduce yourself to a potential host?
And yeah, that's the pitching. That is the pitching. And if I could, there are actually 5 crucial steps in the whole strategic process of going about this. And this is just like speaking from the stage, like TEDx talking, like being on TV. You need to have a strategy, and I'm sure your guests at speaking to TEDx talking will tell you, no, you just don't wander on that stage and speak. And the 5 steps of the strategy are: know your story, know what it is you need to say to really get across to that potential audience who you are, what you do, and why it matters to them. Then identify the shows that are the best ones for you. You don't want to be on the wrong shows. It's going to make you look bad. And the third one is the pitching. And what you need to do is first nail down those first 2. And then you need to, it's work. You found the show that's the right one for you. Now you need to go listen to it. You need to see where you're going to fit in it. You need to know, what value can I possibly be bringing to this host show? Because literally it is anywhere from 10 to 20 hours a week just to create that episode. So they've got to know right away when you contact them. Generally, find out who you should be speaking to, send them an email. It's all framed in terms of what's in it for them. Show them that you know their show and how you see yourself fitting in with it, where you bring the value, and how you're going to help them promote it, because that's something that a lot of podcast guests don't know they should be doing.
I think that's really helpful. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think you have a question from Angela.
Yep. What best practices can you share about being a podcast guest and how it differs from being a presenter or guest speaker?
When you're a guest speaker, the biggest difference there is the interview format. So that goes back to that first thing that I mentioned, which is your story. You can call it your signature story, your brand story, whatever it is. You have to have that nailed. You have to know exactly the points you need to get across in this. But as a podcast guest, you're doing it. It's kind of a dance with the host, and it's got to be in a conversational format. And you're kind of negotiating the meaning of all this and creating this conversation based on the questions they're asking you. So it's a little bit like ballroom dancing, backwards and in heels sort of thing. You know what it is you need to achieve, but you've got to do it within the confines of the format of the show and the questions that the host is asking you, keeping it light, keeping it interesting. Again, that's why you need to know the host, the show, and what it is you need to say.
Kind of fun when somebody has a little bit of information or a little bit of background story that they ask you in return, and it kind of makes it like, oh, we're all putting an effort into this. We're all in this together to try to create something wonderful. So
and you're co-creating a very engaging conversation between the host and that guest. You are creating something that the listener, and listeners love conversation. The best feedback I get on my podcast is the ones where people come back and say, that was fantastic. It was like listening to 2 friends talk about a really interesting subject.
Yeah.
So that's what you're aiming for. And you've got to be prepared to do that.
What do you share with guests to be prepared for the show? How do you get your guests prepared? Do you have a quick format?
I am really unlike most hosts in that, and my guests will say that there's like, wow, I felt like I really had to jump through a lot of hoops. But the reason I did that is because I totally design and format my interviews, because I want by the end of that interview, my goal is that the listener is going to be thinking, the person that I interviewed, they're going to be thinking, she's amazing. Oh my God, I need to work with her, or I need to tell somebody about her. And that doesn't happen by accident. Again, that's the whole story and the way it's sequenced and the way it comes out. So I have my guests fill out their bio, their headshots, their hashtags, their keywords. You have to know those things. But also, what's the problem you solve? Why does that problem matter? What's your solution? And how do you help people? It generally is the arc of the narrative. So they have to fill out all that information. I ask them some probing questions. I also do a pre-call. And that's something, if you're looking for a show to be on, those are things you might want to look for. because if they're not doing a pre-call and they don't have an intake form to get your information, there's a fairly low chance that you're going to have an interview with them that really lets you shine, because they don't know anything about you.
Yeah, right. What is a good length for a podcast?
A good length?
Yeah.
Yes. The average podcast these days, it kind of varies, and they keep the stats on it from month to month. It's always somewhere between 35 and 40 minutes. Shorter for a solo episode, but for interviews, because it's two people talking, it's 35 to 40 minutes. The juicy thing about that is that gives you a lot of time to tell your story and engage. But podcast listeners, unlike consumers of any other content, listen to 80%, on average, 80% of an episode. That means that 45 minutes, you're in their head for 32 minutes, telling your story, being attractive and engaging. And so, yeah, again, that's why you need to be prepared.
What do you think about being live versus recorded?
I personally, I'm fine with live, but for my guest's sake, because again, I want to produce an episode that for them can end up being something that and you should, if you've been on a podcast, you should have that on your website. You can have it so that people can click through and listen to it. This is amazing anchor content that people can be accessing that really gives them a deep look into who you are and what kind of person you are, what it would be like to work with you. The important thing is to get that content on your website and everywhere else so people can find it. Sorry, did I answer your question, Tracy?
Well, it was the audience's question, but I think they just want to know, which are you more comfortable with, live or recorded?
Yes, got off track. I like to do recorded with my guests so that if something happens and they're like, I screwed up, like happened earlier on this call, we can edit that so that it's a seamless, beautiful, produced thing. Live, there is the excitement of the spontaneity of it all. So if you're comfortable speaking and you've done a lot of it, and again, you know your story, then live can be a real boon to the collection of the content you're creating.
September, do you have anything coming up that you want to share with our guests about some upcoming events or anything that's exciting going on for you?
Yes. On an ongoing basis, I work with private clients to help them formulate those 5 elements of the strategic podcast guesting process. I'm going to be running a program in the new year. I'm thinking starting from about the 3rd week of January, but I'm really excited. In February, I'm going to be running a hybrid event from here in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, that will be streaming out to the world, but also here, called So You Want to Start a Podcast. And it's all about how you figure out what's right for you. Is it podcasting, or is it podcast guesting, or is it a hybrid of both?
And with that, I want to thank you, September, because we have had just a really informative, great episode today. And I appreciate you so much coming on the show. It's been a pleasure. It's been great. And we're going to put all of your information on theconnectshow.com/September Smith.